continue with the theme of candle lighting, because there's quite a few chapters in this book. The lights are kindled in the room where the meal is to be served. Candles are normally used, but olive oil is ideal, as you've seen with some people. But the practice is to kindle 2 lights to represent the expressions Shamor and Zachor. In some homes, a light is kindled for each child. Others observe the custom of kindling 7 lights, like the menorah of the temple, or for each day of the week. Some kindle 10 lights, corresponding to the number of commandments to the two tablets of the law. In some families, unmarried daughters also kindle a light. The earliest time for kindling lights is Plaga Mincha. If the lights were kindled beforehand, they should be extinguished and relit with a new blessing prior to the commencement of Shabbos. So Plaga Mincha is the earliest time. You can say Mincha, and it's a significant time. But as I say, if one did light it at that time, it has to burn like half an hour into the dark, like your Hanukkah lights, because otherwise it defeats the purpose. So you've got to have enough oil or enough wick on your candles. If you are going to light it earlier than Shkia, candle lighting time, so you can have the effect of it when Shabbos comes in, to create the light and the pleasant atmosphere that the lights do. Okay, last one. It is vital that the kindling does not take place after sunset. So this would constitute a malacha. If a woman is likely to be late in carrying out the mitzvah, her husband or another member of her household must do it instead. So that's it. So light at the right time, basically, or before the right time.
Arthur's just disappeared now.
Okay.
All right, just.
Should I phone him?
No, he knows he's disappeared. He might have a technical hassle. All right, just one thing I wanted you guys to know as a matter of interest. If you've got, especially in Israel, if you've got family or friends in South Africa that are not from, and your Chag is out, you've got to be very careful on your, not to send them any WhatsApp message, because from people would wait, but if they don't keep Shabbos or 2 days of Yom Tov, you could get them to be transmitting inadvertently.
It doesn't go to a server and it's there. If they want to pick it up, that's their business.
No, they're picking up your particular message as a result of seeing communication with you. If they break Shabbos or Yom Tov on their account, that's their business. If they've done it directly because of responding to a message that you've done or an email that you've done, you have caused that catalyst to come into play. So one has to be careful. If you've got friends or family that are not from, to state to them that not to send you any messages, and you won't send any messages during that Chol Hamoed period.
Yeah.
Okay.
They mustn't send if they're not keeping. They mustn't send it while it's still yontif for them either to you.
Yeah. In other words, whatever they're doing their own thing, but it's more important that you don't cause it. In other words,
and if they do send it to you, then open it up only after that. What's their chag for them?
Correct. But that's not really a halachic issue because it's not Yom Tov for you. You cannot cause, if you're keeping 1 day of Pesach, for example, on the second day, which is Chol Hamoed for you, where you can do activities, but it's still Pesach for them, you can't send them any sort of message or anything that they would react to, because it's incumbent upon them to keep 2 days of Yom Tov. That's what I'm saying. It's more that way than the other way around. If it's no longer Yom Tov for you, you can do it. It's not an issue. But you can't...
send messages to them.
Correct. All right, let's get started. Mate, are you okay? I'll see you back.
Yeah, no, the internet died, so I don't know why it wasn't charging, so I just reconnected the cables on.
No problem.
So I'm using my other phone now.
All right, so just a quick summary for yesterday is that I'm just going to quickly share my screen. I want to be done with this as quickly as possible. All right, so there were 2 versions of the braai, so that's the bottom line.
Okay.
The one version what we learned first in the Gemara is, and they're all explanations of Rav Yossi Bar Chanina, but there's two cases. The first case is that the victim entered without permission, and then the carpenter is not liable to exile. The second case is the victim entered with permission, and the carpenter is liable. But we don't know what that word liable means in the Gemara. It never says liable to exile. So on that basis, we're learning two things. Let's just get the simple case out of the way. If the carpenter didn't give permission for his client to come downstairs, and his client of his own volition decided to come downstairs and was severely injured, he's not liable to pay for those four things. What are those four things? It's actual damage, nezek shalom, it's tsar, pain, it's medical expenses, and it's convalescing recovery. You don't pay the fifth thing, humiliation, because there was no intent to cause bodily harm. Negligence is not quite intent. Intent is when you go into a bar fight and you want to split the other guy's face open. That's intent. Okay. Not liable to exile. He's obviously not liable to exile because he never gave permission to the person to come down, and it is still his domain. And if you said no, it's no. Okay, that's the first version. According to the second version of Rav Yossi Bar Chanina, by Rav Papa's explanation of Rava, he's liable to the four things. The reason he's liable to the four things, what do we mean? The four damages, types of damages you pay for injuring somebody else, is although the victim entered without permission, the carpenter was aware that he was there. So therefore, it's not just, as Rashi said, a straightforward case where he said, no, you can't come down, and the guy did not come down. The guy did come down, and the carpenter heard that the guy came down. And because his customer came down and he carried on with very dangerous equipment, he has a cognizance and an awareness that he's there, and he's liable for the four things. And then the question is, well, why is he not liable to exile? So he's not liable to exile in that case because it does not mimic the prototypical case of the forest. It is his domain, and he did not give permission for that person to enter. Okay? And since he did not give permission for that person to enter, it's still his domain. You know?
Yeah.
It's so that is not a comparable case. If you want to say, but as Gavin did mention yesterday, well, you know, technically the guy is aware he's there, so there's a certain amount of liability. So there is liability to a certain extent, but the point of it is the other person had no permission to be there. And since he had no permission to be there, he's also a party to the responsibility of having himself killed, because the carpenter did not say he could come downstairs. In terms of Shemayim, Gavin is correct that Hashem would hold a person responsible if they were aware that the person was there, even if a human court wouldn't send them to exile. Another version of that's not liable to exile, which was a good question that he asked, is that does he deserve protection from the family that are looking now to lynch him and kill him? Well, the thing of it is, if he doesn't get that protection, it's because he certainly was aware that that person was there. And since he's liable to the four things because there was an awareness, maybe he doesn't get the protection of the of having the family not lynch him because he didn't care that he was working on equipment and had killed somebody. So although they can't send him to exile, the courts, the family can certainly have a nice conversation with him. They might end up a little bit different. They might not kill him. They might have beat him to death. They might not kill him. So we discussed the first case. I just want to share my screen here a second.
Okay, I can go back here now. Are you going back sharing your screen? And I'm going back to the other screen.
Art, can I continue?
Yeah, go.
So we said that there might be a case. There is a commentary, I think, by Tosfot. But it didn't expand on it in the Schottenstein that said in a way, it's a possibility that you could think there would be liable in the first case where the victim entered without permission, but the carpenter is aware that that person is there, because just like in the forest, you're aware somebody else could be there, and he is definitely aware. But for some reason, he doesn't get exiled. Maybe because it's almost bordering on the same sort of negligence as if you've given permission, and therefore, if the family lynch him, who cares? I don't know. Tosfot's obviously beyond me. I don't have access to that with Schottenstein. But he did say something about that. In that case, it might mimic the prototypical case. Let's look at the last case. The last case is clear. The victim entered with permission. The carpenter is liable. There is fully liable because there's no ways that the victim, the client, can share any of the responsibility. He entered assuming it was safe. And it's obvious it's liable that the carpenter must pay him for the 4 types of damage if he injures him. And the carpenter is not liable to exile because in that particular case, there are 2 explanations. And it's quite difficult to understand. In the first explanation that the Gemara gives of Rav Yossi Bar Chanina, it states that, well, it's not prototypically like the forest case in that we're dealing with domain differences. And those domain differences are that one is a private domain and the other is a public domain. And Rava has a problem with it because Rava said, well, it doesn't completely make sense and it doesn't sit well with him as it didn't sit well with Gavin. The reason being is that, how different is it? I mean, the reality is the minute he gave him permission, he should be aware that he's there. I mean, he gave him permission, so what's his excuse? Why shouldn't he get liable for exile? So Rava's explanation on Rav Yossi Bar Chanina is that, in fact, exile is too good for him. Why? Because exile is a place you send for refuge so the family of the victim doesn't kill you. So the fact of it is he doesn't deserve that sort of protection because it was what you call unintentional murder bordering on the intentional. And he said further to which the kapora at which exile offers, you're not entitled to that sort of kapora. You're going to face the music and full in the next world. So in that particular case, that's Rava's explanation of Rav Yossi Bar Chanina. Now, since he explained that's what Rav Yossi Bar Chanina meant, he doesn't agree with Rav Yossi Bar Chanina, according to his explanation, because he said there are cases where there is unintentional murder bordering on intentional, at which a person does get exiled. The first case is when you have an agent of the court, when the court has established that a person can physiologically only handle a certain amount of lashes because they're in a weak condition, and the agent of the court lashed this person one more time than what was prescribed and the person died. In that case, he is liable to exile. So that's his proof. The Gemara's response to Rav is very clear. He said, listen, in this particular case, the agent of the court that was giving the lashes, as Kevin brilliantly pointed out, this was not intentional. He miscounted. And then further to which it said he's even not liable because it was the judge who did the miscount. Again, you've got 3 judges. The first judge reads the scriptural verses. The second judge gives the count. And the third judge gives the issue of instruction saying strike him. So at least the second and third judge, to a certain extent, should be party to it. So why is this agent of the court seeing exile? It seems unfair. It seems the judge should have. So firstly, the principle of what we learn there very clearly is that there's ein shaliach lidbar avera, which means that the law doesn't recognize agency in a matter of transgression. What does that mean? There's something called grammar, which is indirect, and indirect basically means that if you hire a hitman in the case of an intentional murder and the hitman creates the actual kill, the Beis Din can't sentence the one that gave the verbal instruction to the death penalty. When they get to Shamayim, when they get to Shemaim, of course, they're going to have liability. But the point of it is the earthly court can't get involved in that sort of thing. In this case, the judge obviously never meant to kill him, and therefore, as an agent, he never was the one that actually struck this individual. So therefore, he's not liable to exile. So what does seem still that the question reasserts itself, that it would seem unfair that the agent of the court that issued the lashes should be given exile. And the reason being is that he has to take responsibility for the fact that he should have kept his own count. Gavin also asked a question, which was, isn't this kind of disrespectful? And the answer to that is that if he's going to spend the rest of his life away from the family and in exile, the truth of it is there's a lot at stake. Now, he doesn't have to deliver the message in a disrespectful manner. We also said that he's not questioning the judge's authority. What he's doing is he should be making notes like 1205, 6th lash, 1208, 7th lash, etc., so that if before he lashes, he does his own count, he could always take it to the judge when the third judge says strike him, and go back to the second judge and say, Judge, I've written down a different count. Can we check? And it's not showing disrespect. You must know, even one thing that Judaism is very different to Christianity is that even all our patriarchs and Moshe Rabbeinu were human beings, and they were also nobody's perfect. Everybody makes mistakes, them included. So why can't a judge make a mistake? So as far as that's concerned, then Rava went to his next proof. What was Rava's next proof? About that somebody that's an unintentional murderer bordering on intentional, that throws the stones in the public domain, is liable to exile. So this is a proof against his explanation of Rav Yossi Bar Chanina that exile is too good for this person, because when he threw the stone, he killed the person. And then it goes through an entire case of, well, he never intended to do it. He was dismantling his wall, so he was grossly negligent, but his intention wasn't to kill. And said, even so, you can't throw stones. Then the Gemara said, no, he was dismantling his wall at night. And they said, well, what happens if there's somebody walking at night? He shouldn't have done it. And then they said, no, in actual fact, he threw it in a trash can. So then the issue was during the day, but in a trash can. And then it says, well, what happens when the vagrants use it as a public latrine to relieve themselves? That's if people frequent it often, that's an unintentional murder bordering on intentional, because you're liable to kill or hurt somebody there. And they were saying it wasn't frequented often. But then if it wasn't frequented, then it's an unavoidable mishap. You shouldn't be responsible for exile at all. So Rav Papa then turns around and says, look, the explanation is as follows. It's quite clear that there are occasionally people that use the latrine during the day and not and not only at night, but it's so occasional that you should have checked, and that's what makes you liable for exile. But it's not so common so that it's bordering on the intentional. So that's not a conclusive proof for Rava in terms of the unintentional bordering on the intentional for allowance of exile. And if you have a look at the screen that we've got, it's very clear, is that the reason in the last case, according to Rav Papa, that he is liable to exile, when he gave just hang on a second, when he gave permission, is how do I put this very simply, is that the minute he gives permission, he can no longer claim it's his private domain, and therefore it offers him some protection. As Gavin said yesterday, that there are two cases that we learn of the forest. You must know Gavin's been paying attention. If we're quoting Rav Gavin, or Rav Hillel, as I like to call him, then you must know he's paying attention. So what he said is quite clear. In the case of the forest, there are two possible cases. The one is that perhaps there could be somebody in the forest and you're doing something stupid that could be liable for death or injury. you're liable for exile. Perhaps there could be something. But when you walk with your friend there and you're preparing lunch and you're chopping wood and you know your friend is there, you're liable for exile, because then for sure you're liable because you know somebody is there for sure. Okay? It says, and if a Jew walked with his friend in the forest, etc., etc. So, I mean, in that case, how's this different to any to the carpenter who says to his client, you can come through, and he continually works on deadly equipment? It's a problem. It's exactly the case of the forest. The minute he's given permission, he can't start to pull the domain card issue and say he's not liable to exile. Indeed, he's liable to exile, according to Rav Papa's explanation of Rava. Does that make sense? We said that according to the Gemara, we explained why he's not liable to exile. But according to Rav Papa, he said there's no ways that you, according to Rav Papa's explanation of Rava, there's no ways that you cannot be liable to exile, because it actually is exactly the case of the forest. And the minute you've given permission, you no longer have a private domain excuse. All right, so that's the summary of where we've hit up until now.
Damon?
Yeah.
In that chart, it said Rav Hanina's first opinion, then his second opinion. That's what confused me a bit.
Okay, so it's a good question. I'll explain it. Look, so basically, Rav Yossi Bar Hanina, he gave this explanation of liability, but there were different people that explained his reasoning, because the Gemara said, all it says in the Gemara is, when he gave his opinion, is very, very clear, is that this is all it said in the Brisa. The victim entered without permission. The carpenter is not liable, and we don't know what he's not liable for. So it had to be explained about damages and exile versus a case of injury versus death. The last case, where the victim entered with permission, the carpenter is liable. Okay? In that particular case, we want to know liable for what? It doesn't mention the word exile. So that's why we had to learn that there's a difference between liability for damage and liability for exile. They're two different cases. There's some cases where you are liable for the damage, but exile is very extreme. So we want to. So it's defining all the different opinions in the Gemara. Firstly, Rav Yossi Bar Hanina's explanation given by the Gemara. Then Rava's explanation of Rav Yossi Bar Hanina. Then Rava's counter argument against his explanation of Rav Yossi Bar Hanina. Then Rav Papa's explanation of Rava. That's what we're dealing with, guys. Now,
okay. So that's just okay.
Yeah, what were you going to ask?
I want to ask something. Okay, I want to ask something. When it comes to exile and death penalty, which is like exile the preferable one to the death penalty? Obviously, so you have levels. You got damages, and then you got exile, and then you got the hardest one that's try to stop is death penalty. Am I correct?
Yeah. Listen, when you're being told you're going to go to exile for the rest of your life, you know your life isn't going aces. I agree with you.
Okay.
But it's better than one losing their life. I mean, obviously, one having imprisonment for lifetime, they had to go to a city of refuge. It's not like what you're dealing with here, like in Alcatraz, where you're with Baba that likes to spend time with you in the evening, spooning you. We're going to edit that.
High security facility.
No, more worried about the homosexual rape. I mean, you didn't have those sort of cases there in the city of refuge. It was a normal city where like-minded people like you that were very negligent would all share your common space. So you're not dealing with probably the highest levels of society if you all landed up there. But you're dealing with people that have made similar mistakes to you. So I would think to a certain extent it's a healing process where you get a chance to reflect on what you've done. I think it's far less, dramatic than getting the death penalty.
I want to raise something I think it's interesting, is that when it comes to, what's it called? This, fleeing to the place of refuge, city of refuge, Also, if you look at the Golden Jubilee year, when all the slaves are released, or every 7 years, wouldn't it entice people to do stuff wrong when it's like, if the Kohen Gadol is like 89 years old? I mean, surely there's a spark in stuff going wrong, because people know that they're not going to be in the city of refuge for too long, and if the Golden Jubilee or the 7 years is coming close, it's more sort of incentive to take a chance.
I think it's a good question. No, I think it's a great question.
It's a bit risky, because it's kind of questioning the moral fiber of this.
What were you going to say, Off? What are you going to say, mate?
No, I was going to say, most people normally don't go out their way to shoot a piece of wood into somebody's face, or to get away to exile. I mean, it's not like maybe other crimes, but not accidental crimes.
I think Arthur's got a great answer, to be honest, because let's just...
For the one part. One part, I agree.
Let's just see where Arthur's coming from. Let's separate the two issues. The two issues are the issue is overall what you can get away with. That's the title of this. I know it goes under a subsection of your book, Getting Away with Murder, that you were going to write with Ian Shapiro on Groma in Sanhedrin. This is a subsection.
No, I have to write it myself.
How do you get away with certain things? So let's just address both the issues. Arthur's got a great point. Anybody that's normal and not a sociopath or a psychopath would not relish killing another Jew. It's just nobody wants to kill another human being, especially in a case where there's no provocation. So let me give you an example. There's no provocation in this case, because if he killed him where it was in retaliation or a road rage incident or something like that, that would go under death penalty with capital offense. This is for something accidental. Firstly, in terms of some accident you plan to make it look like an accident, where you go to the city of refuge and get exiled, okay? There's a process involved with that. I don't know what the process is involved in that, but the thing of it is, I don't think anybody would say, oh, hang on, the Cohen's 89 years old. Let me just knock off a Jew, because I've never experienced going to the city of exile for a short period of time and seeing the sights. It just doesn't make sense that somebody would do it.
Right. Okay, so I agree with that. That's a good answer. Thank you. But the one that... No, it's a good answer. It's 100%. The second one is still a problem, though, with theft, because theft will definitely increase when it comes closer to those, because that's different. A thief is a thief.
I hear you. So you're saying because the amount of period of time when they are going to be released. So firstly, you have to live a long time to get your timing right. The Jubilee year is on the 5th. Isn't it on the 50th year, Kevin?
It's on, I think.
It's on the 50th.
Oh, okay.
It's on the, I think there's 7 cycles of 7, which are 49. I think on the 50th year, it's the Jubilee year.
At the end of the 49th
it's like Shavuot. It's like Shavuot, something.
Right. So how do you get the timing so right in your life, where suddenly you've been doing the right thing, and you hit the age of 38, for example, 38. And the Jubilee year is going to hit when you're 38, but 50 years have transpired, because the last Jubilee year was 12 years before you were born. At 38, when you've had a good track record, you suddenly get a bee in your bonnet that you want to steal something, because you could get out in a relatively short period of time of 8 months. You had a good track record all of a sudden, or let's say you had a bad track record. If you had a bad track record all along, you wouldn't suddenly become an offender at 38 and say, well, let me try and see what it's like to serve somebody and then get out after 8 months. That wouldn't hit you. You would have had a habitual patterning of being a juvenile delinquent, and it would be escalating. That's always what happens with crimes, is that they come from dysfunctional families and they create crimes from a young age, and it goes from mild shoplifting to grand theft, larceny to murder, etc. It escalates. If you have a look at any criminal.
I'm talking about those people.
No. So I'm talking about those people as well. You'd have to get the timing pretty right within a period of 50 years. Because what I'm saying is, if the Jubilee year happened 12 years before you were born, and now you've had a whole life of crime, and now at 38, you were going to get the opportunity to get freed early. You would have at least been incarcerated for a lot of your life up until the time when you got your winning lottery ticket to get out. And after the Jubilee year, guess what? You created another crime and you got 50 years before you see the light of day.
Well, these guys, if they're that stupid, that's a problem. But I mean...
do you understand what I'm saying? You've got a short window period, but if you're a habitual criminal, you're going to end up back serving time again under a master for another 7 years, because you're going to end up getting yourself locked into servitude. And if you've never done crime, you're not going to say, suddenly want the opportunity now because there's this window period. So either you've done a lot of time before and you do get a brief window period and you don't learn your lesson and you land back into trouble, or you learn your lesson and you don't land back into trouble. But you don't get away with anything because your nature is your nature.
Yeah, and by the time you get to Shemaim, I wouldn't want to be there. And the other best part, can you imagine when the guy's 89, he lives to 120? He only got 31 years.
Exactly. But Gav, do you see the point at which I'm trying to say?
Yeah, but I do agree with you. But I do think that there would be a spark specifically on thefts. I do think there'll be a bit of a spark.
There might be a spark, but even if you got out on a short spark, you still have that servitude up until that period. So maybe there would be a spark for 6 months, 8 months. But the minute that Jubilee year is done, you do a full sentence. What happens if you put in a court-instituted policy that people get tried after the Jubilee year if they've done a crime less than 8 months before?
They might do that. That's very clever. Yeah, that's very clever.
Yeah, I mean, there's a myriad of things. I don't know how the practical application would work. All right, but I want to do within the next 15 minutes this last part of the Gemara, and then we're done.
Let's go.
Great.
All right, guys, do you think the summary worked so far? Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, you got standing, so it must have worked.
All right. Yeah. All right. So then what we discussed quickly is the case of the liability to exile. Rav Papa's explanation that when the carpenter gave permission, he is liable to exile. It's not like the Gemara's explanation of Rav Yossi Bar Chanina, because he said the minute he's given permission, he's as aware of somebody there as when he walked in the forest with somebody. There's no difference.
Yeah.
No difference. And but that does actually make logical sense, by the way, guys. It really does to me. So, but there's a problem because there's a brisa that contradicts it. It said if one enters the shop of a blacksmith and sparks flew from the hammer and an anvil struck him on the face and he died, then even if the person had entered with permission, he's exempted to exile. Okay? So he's saying this brisa seems to contradict Rav Papa's version of Rav's version of Rav Yossi Bar Chanina, which said he is liable for exile. So this is saying he's not liable for exile, saying it's a similar case. How is this contradiction resolved by Rav Papa? Okay? And the Gemara is saying very, very clearly, it was a blacksmith's apprentice. And the obvious answer to that is, okay, just because he worked for him, does he entitle him to be killed? You know, is he less of a human being than anybody else? You say, no, there's nothing to do with it. It has to do with the fact that, if somebody you paying to do a job and the guy says, please stay out of that area, you don't take it that seriously. You're paying him for a service. What's the case with the blacksmith? He doesn't want to lose his job, so he's not going to defy a direct instruction. And therefore, if the blacksmith has told his apprentice to go home and the blacksmith is still there and he gets himself killed, then the blacksmith has no reason to think that his apprentice hadn't listened to him. It's not like a client that does his own thing because he doesn't fear the blacksmith because he's paying the blacksmith. He's not losing employment from the blacksmith if he fails to follow instructions. That's what we basically said. Does that make sense?
Also, a private individual doesn't know how dangerous the equipment is. The what's it called? The guy that works for him, the apprentice, knows exactly how dangerous the equipment is.
I think that's a good point. I think that a client would be much more ignorant than a blacksmith's apprentice who knows that it's not a very bright idea to go downstairs when there's sparks flying and that he has a certain amount of liability in this case, which is why the blacksmith doesn't go to exile, because the apprentice is liable to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And blacksmith has no reason to think that his apprentice had to listen to him, because, as Gavin said, he knows the equipment is dangerous, and B, you only listen quite well to the person that's paying you. Otherwise, you don't keep a long-term job. All right, so we are up to date with where we are at the moment. Okay. Let's see how long we've got. We've got 10 minutes. Okay. Let's just see. We're on 33A1. All right. So the Gemara cites a third version of Rav Yossi Bachan in the statement. I want to try and go through this quickly without questions, guys. Rav Zavid said in the name of Rava. Now, Rav Zavid is explaining Rava. Okay, Rav Yossi Bachan in a statement. This is the third version. In regard to the following brisa, as Zuma says, listen carefully. The expression "and it finds" excludes a case in which the victim is one who makes himself found. Okay? One who moves himself in the path of the projectile after it has been released by the thrower. Guys, just hang on a second. I've just had the cat here that jumps on things and moves things. All right, so guys, what is Rav Zavid talking about, Rava? He's talking about a different case. There's a biblical verse in the prototype of the forest. And what does it actually say? So in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 5, Kevin, it states that the woodchop in the forest is liable where the axe head or the woodchop finds his fellow. That's the term it uses, finds his fellow who dies. Okay? So what does he mean, finds his fellows? It comes off and it happens to find a person. Bang. Now, we're talking about, Kevin, here, a different case. The idiot in this particular case stuck his head out to see what was going on, where a guy was running lethal equipment. So in that case, he found the projectile. The projectile never found him. So what Rav Zavid said in the name of Rava is that if we're talking about a particular case where the person stuck their head out in terms of the projectile, whose fault is that? Kevin, whose fault is that? Kev, you're falling asleep.
If a person stuck his head out and it's his fault.
Exactly. So
he should have known better. You've got to use common sense as well.
Said of Rava that what it's talking about here is that the biblical term, if the projectile finds itself to the victim, meaning there it comes off and it clips somebody. Here it's saying that the person finds the projectile. Now, whenever you find a projectile and you stick your head in the way, you are liable. So what it says here is the expression of it finds itself excludes a case in which the victim who made himself found. In other words, one who moves himself into the path of the projectile after it had been released by the thrower. Say somebody's throwing a stone, for example. So based on this, Rav Eliezer Ben Yaakov said, and if one released the stone, and in this one, the victim stuck out his head and intercepted it and was killed, the thrower is not liable, since the scriptural requirement of "and it finds" has not been met. It was regarding this brisa that Rav Yossi Bachanina said, he is not liable to exile, but he would be liable to pay for 4 things if his victim was injured rather than killed by a stone. So, what we want to say here is, if you're not subject to exile because the guy stuck his head in the way, why would you be liable for the 4 things?
Yeah.
Well, what are you doing throwing your stone near somebody? Okay, they were a moron. They stuck their head in the way, granted. And then you can't be liable to lose the rest of your life to go to exile. So what we're saying is, yes, sometimes things of exile are judged much more stringently. Does that make sense? So in other words, to lose the rest of your life to go to exile, you've got to be completely culpable, and the other person can't have a party to it. The minute the other person has entered the place without permission, or the minute the other person stuck his head in the way to stop a projectile, they are partly liable, and therefore you don't deserve to go to exile because the onus is on both parties. Okay? But in a case of damage, where you're only paying money, it's much more strict in the law. Why? Because in fact you have injured somebody. You shouldn't have been throwing your stone near a person anyway. In other words, if somebody is a kilometer away from you, or 400 meters, Kevin, how would they stick their head down in front of a projectile? They couldn't do it. So yes, they were stupid. Yes, they were negligent, the victim. Yes, as follows. So why is the person liable for damages? Because they shouldn't have been throwing the stone near somebody that could possibly have stuck their head in the way. They should be far away from throwing stones near a person. So they should share in the liability for damage. But because the other person intercepted the stone, they co-liable, and in terms of the death they caused themselves. Therefore, the other person doesn't deserve something as dramatic as exile. Okay?
So it's a leniency.
Yeah, that's
for the.
That's according to Rav Yossi Bar Chanina. Okay, and this is explained by Eliezer ben Yaakov. Okay, so it was regarding this price that Rav Yossi Bar Chanina said he is not liable to exile, but he would be liable to pay for the four things if his victim was injured rather than killed by the stone. Okay, so the Gemara remarks that this different version of Rav Yossi Bar Chanina's statement, the one who teaches it in regard to this brisa, in other words, concerning the intercepted stone, holds that it certainly applies in regard to the first brisa concerning the carpenter. So what the heaven does that mean? The one who teaches in regard to this brisa concerning the intercepted stone holds that it's certainly liable in regard to the first brisa concerning the carpenter. Okay, I will explain to you exactly what it means. Compliments of Schottenstein. If the one who throws the stone is considered grossly negligent and liable to pay for four things, even though he injured somebody whose presence he was never aware of, because the guy suddenly popped his head in the way, then certainly the carpenter who was aware that his victim had entered the shop is considered grossly negligent for not checking to see that he is left, and he is liable to pay for the four things. So according to Rashi, if in this case he still has to pay for the four things, even though the guy surprised him by sticking his head in the way and intercepted the stone, in a case for sure, according to Rashi, even if he didn't grant permission, but he was aware that the person was there, and certainly where he granted permission for the carpenter, for the person to be there, in either case, there is a problem. He is certainly liable to the four things. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Either he has to have an awareness, even if he didn't grant permission, or he granted permission, which is obviously a state of awareness. So that's Rashi's explanation. So the Gemara remarks regarding these different versions. The one who teaches this brisa concerning the intercepted stone holds that he certainly applies in regards to the first brisa concerning the carpenter because of the awareness. But the one who teaches it in regard to the first brisa concerning the carpenter will say it only applies to that case. Okay? Yeah, okay.
Just a quick question. So the genius that put their head out after a projectile was flying through the air and got killed, that's not permission? That's actually a case of basically not permission?
Well, that's certainly a case of being surprised, because exactly the Gemara is answering your question right now. It says, but in regard to the case of this brisa concerning the intercepted stone, the law would be that he is completely free from liability. Even in a case of injury, he's not even liable to pay for the four things. So what it's saying is, you do have opinions here that say the carpenter is responsible, because in the case of the carpenter, he was either aware that the person was there, but let's just take the second case where he gave permission. He was definitely aware that he was there, and that's why he pays the damages for the four things. But in this case, he's completely free from liability, even in the case of injury, and he's not liable to pay for the four things because he's not aware at all. So there's two different opinions here. The one is that if you have to teach that this brisa, according to Rav Eliezer Bar Yaakov, said that he is liable for the 4 things, then Rav Yossi Bar Chanina would say that it's because the person that's throwing the stone shouldn't even be near anybody. In other words, the fact of it is the person might surprise him, but he shouldn't even be within the jurisdiction of people. And there's a different opinion that turns around and says, no, he's completely free from liability because the guy suddenly surprised him and popped his head in the way and either got injured or killed. If he got injured, he's not liable to pay for the things, nor is he liable to be exiled. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
How many minutes are left, guys?
135.
135.
All right. So I'm not going to go through this last part about workers, etc. We're going to continue on 33A1, and we're going to discuss about the carpenter and the blacksmith next time in about a week and a bit. I want to thank you guys very, very much.
Shkar, thank you.
Everybody have a good Pesach.
Chag Sameach.